Well, hi there. This is an animal. And so is this. And so is this. And this is a bagel. You have a horrible similarity to bagels. We'll get to that in a minute. Because this is an animal. And so is this. And so is this. And that might have you seriously questioning if you even know what an animal is. So we have a lot to talk about today. Because those aren't even the weirdest ones. There are all sorts of animals that you probably don't know exist. So let's change that. We should probably start with what an animal is, because you probably don't know. I know a lot of people that think that these are not animals. So we might have a hard time talking about these without explaining what an animal is. Animals are multicellular, meaning that they're comprised of more than one cell as adults. But they aren't the only multicellular organisms. Plants and fungi would be a couple of other examples. They are eukaryotes, meaning that they have a true nucleus to their cells. Their DNA has its own membrane to keep it safe. They have other membrane-bound organelles, and in most cases have bacterial endosymbiotes called mitochondria. Of course, so do plants and fungi. Animals are heterotrophic, meaning that they eat other things for energy. They don't eat themselves like plants do. They aren't autotrophic. So animals are multicellular eukaryotic heterotrophs, like fungi. And the thing that really sets animals apart from everything else? Wait for it. Collagen. So animals are a bit stretchy. And despite being similar in many ways to other multicellular organisms like plants and fungi, their closest relatives appear to be these, the choanoflagellates, which, being single-celled eukaryotes, historically would have been lumped into the protista, until we found out that the protista as a clade would also include all of the multicellular eukaryotes, like you. Now we don't really use the term protista. Eukarya does the job better. And if finding out that protists aren't a good group wasn't upsetting enough, wait until we get to the fact that prokarya also isn't a clade. Cellular life forms all seem to fall into two clades, and the eukarya might be the most exciting of all. But it alone isn't one of the two. The two clades are the bacteria and the archaea. Historically, we would have called these two groups the prokaryotes. The problem is that the eukaryotes are part of the archaea. But it's even better because, do you remember what I said earlier about mitochondria? Well, if you don't, mitochondria are themselves a separate cell that lives inside of eukaryotic cells. And that cell is a bacterium. The same is true for chloroplasts, which means that plants never actually evolved the ability to do photosynthesis. They stole it from bacteria. More accurately, they stole the whole bacteria. But what this means is that eukaryotes are archaeans, with bacterial cells living inside of them. Unless it is part of the monocercomonoides, the only known eukaryotes without mitochondria. And while most animals may seem very different from choanoflagellates, as we start to examine the animals in totality, I think you'll discover that this isn't always the case. Especially given that many choanoflagellates are colonial, because the line between a colony of single-celled organisms and a multicellular organism can be a little tricky to draw sometimes. I'll be honest, if you're interested in a video like this one, you're probably rather brilliant, who happens to be the sponsor of today's video. Brilliant brings learning to life through thousands of interactive, hands-on lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. Instead of passively watching, you're actively engaging. Like writing your first lines of code in Python or uncovering trends in real-world data from Spotify and Starbucks. Hands-on learning of this sort is just way more effective than passively watching a lecture, which is the way we're usually taught. Brilliant sharpens your critical thinking and problem-solving skills, making knowledge both memorable and practical. Brilliant also helps you build a powerful daily learning habit. In just minutes a day, you can deepen your understanding and make learning a rewarding part of your routine. Whether you're advancing your career or just keeping your mind sharp, Brilliant is there to support your growth. If you're ready to experience the joy of learning in a way that's engaging, effective, and genuinely fun, visit brilliant.org/Clint or click the link in the description below. You can explore everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. And as a special bonus, you'll enjoy 20% off an annual premium subscription. Happy learning? Stay curious. But let's talk about those collagen colonies that we call animals, shall we? Like I said before, they're basically stretchy multicellular relatives of choanoflagellates. And that will never be so clear as it is with these, the sponges of the phylum Porifera, which are only arguably the basalmost clade of true animals alive today. It may also be these, which really raises the question about how many times nervous systems have independently evolved in the Animalia. But we'll get to those in a second. Because sponges really make you wonder what the difference is between a colony of cells and a multicellular organism. I mean, do you remember Will It Blend?
Will it blend? That is the question.
Well, it turns out that you can play this game with animals. Not that you should. In fact, please don't. But it is possible. And yeah, they blend just fine. Well, I mean, they won't be fine. But you can blend them up really fine. Now, I should specify that most of them will not be fine. I think you can imagine what will happen to most animals. But if you play this game with a sponge, you put a live sponge and water into a blender and blend it up into a fine sponge slushy, and then leave it for a few days, you might be surprised by what you'll find when you come back. A bunch of small, but alive, little sponges. And this is because their individual cells are much more independent than those of most animals. Your cells, all of your cells, would die very quickly if isolated from the other cells in your body. All of your cells are highly specialized and do specific functions very well. But they can't, in isolation, perform all of the functions required to keep themselves alive. There is a trade-off to specialization, and that trade-off is the ability to do a wide number of tasks. The same is somewhat true for most modern human civilizations. Most people are very good at a few specific tasks, but if tasked with surviving unassisted for an extended period of time, most people would lack the generalized suite of abilities required to do so for more than a few days. Well, unlike you, sponges lack true tissues. Each of their cells needs to be able to perform multiple tasks associated with keeping themselves alive. So if they become separated, they can individually keep themselves alive, regroup, and make a comeback. Of course, it comes at the expense of high levels of specialization, though they are more specialized than colonial organisms, and thus we do consider them to be multicellular. Sponges are generally asymmetrical, though some are radially symmetrical, meaning that they're circular in shape and could be divided in half down the middle many ways to produce two mirrored halves. The general shape of a sponge is basically a porous volcano. They tend to be hollow on the inside with a big hole at the top. And if you look at one, it looks like it's doing nothing. But if you look very closely, or you add dye to the water, you can see that they are very busy indeed. They use flagella to pull water through the sides of the volcano into the central chamber. Tiny bits of food are collected as it passes through, and then the water exits through the hole or holes at the top. Not too shabby. So these very simple creatures may be the basalmost clade of animals, and I think that nobody will be surprised if they are. But as we mentioned before, it also may be these. And these are amazing creatures. This is a comb jelly, a member of the phylum Ctenophora. They are simply mesmerizing. And they are very different from sponges in a lot of clear ways, though they are radially symmetrical like some sponges. But they are conspicuously mobile and possess true tissues, including, importantly, a nervous system allowing near instantaneous communication and coordination between cells, even cells that are not in close proximity to one another. And if comb jellies are the basalmost animals alive today, that would mean that sponges are more closely related to all of the other animals, like you, than they are to comb jellies. Meaning that a nervous system has either evolved more than once in the animals or was lost in the periphery. While there are more than 5,000 known species of sponges that live in marine and freshwater habitats around the world, there are fewer than 200 known species of comb jellies. In addition to possessing a nervous system, they also possess muscles, which can be used to bend and move their bodies. Though locomotion is often achieved by the cilia that form rows down their bodies, and that often reflect light in glorious displays of color. Really, if you were going to confuse a comb jelly with anything else, it would probably be with an cnidarian, like a jellyfish. And we'll get to how to distinguish between the two when we discuss them here shortly, though not right away, as they do not appear to be one another's closest relatives. In fact, it's possible that no animal is more distantly related to a jellyfish than is a comb jelly. Jellyfishes are part of the clade of all remaining animals, more closely related to all of them, and perhaps even to the sponges, than to the comb jellies. But within this clade of all of the other animals, they may be the hagfish of all of the other animals. Or it may be these, possibly the strangest of all animals, the placozoan, which is basically a giant multicellular amoeba. Basically a blob of cells. No mouth, no nerves, nothing like that, though they do have some distinct tissue layers. But they are basically just a blob of animal cells. Super weird, and yet apparently still more closely related to all of the animals that we still need to discuss than they are to sponges or comb jellies. But, as we mentioned earlier, comb jellies do have a doppelganger in this group, the well-known cnidaria, which includes things like jellies, corals, anemones, and hydrozoans. Over 11,000 species, where we don't really know how many species of placozoans there are, since they all pretty much look like tiny little blobs. But the cnidaria are a very diverse group indeed. In basic body plan, they, like comb jellies, are radially symmetrical. They're circular. And they have a soft, jelly-like body with muscles and nerves. That said, the similarity appears to be the result of convergence, especially if it turns out that the sponges, in addition to the placozoans, are more closely related to cnidarians than are the comb jellies. One of the easiest ways to distinguish cnidarians from comb jellies, or anything else, is by their stinging cells, called cnidocytes. They are on the tentacles that surround the mouth. Comb jellies may have tentacles as well, but they're just sticky, not venomous. Many cnidarians are sessile, meaning that they are attached to the ground in some way and generally have their mouths pointing up. They're called polyps. Others are motile, meaning that they can move around and are called medusae. Their mouths generally face down. And some pass through both life stages, like we discussed in this video. And that gets us through most of the ambiguity of the Animalia, because from here on we'll be discussing the Bilateria, a group that is considerably less alien and whose internal relationships are overall better understood. It will also get us to your horrible similarity to bagels, and it is a most unfortunate similarity. So I say that the Bilateria is less alien, but you've probably never seen one of these before. This is a member of the phylum Xenocoelomorpha, the hagfish of bilaterians. Though some phylogenies do place them in the Deuterostomia, rather closely related to you. Though more closely related to starfishes and hemichordates, but we'll get to those later. To this point, there has been one feature of animals that all of these have lacked. A permanent anus. Though comb jellies can create a temporary anus by pushing waste through their epidermis, and then, as fast as it was created, it disappears. A transient anus. They can even have more than one at a time, so they sort of have anuses. But nothing that we have discussed has a permanent anus. Cnidarians just multi-purpose their mouths, like you do. Well, probably not you, but they aren't the last group that we'll discuss that do. Because the Xenocoelomorpha, they do the same thing. Yep, they're coprocophers too. Oral defecators, poop spitters. So there are some things that are worse than being a bagel. But I do have a question for you, while we're on the subject of bagels. If you stick your finger through the hole in a bagel, is your finger inside of the bagel or outside of the bagel? Think about that for a second. But anyway, these guys don't have an anus. Know what else they have in common with the other animals we've discussed so far? They don't have a brain. They have a nerve net, a diffuse, uncentralized nervous system, something that they share with the comb jellies and the cnidarians. So having a brain or a permanent dedicated pooping hole clearly are not the defining features of the Bilateria. Bilateria can best be characterized by the type of symmetry exhibited by its members during development. Bilateral symmetry, meaning that there is only one plane through which they could be divided into two mirrored halves. And the xenocoelomorphs are bilaterally symmetrical. And the name xenocoelomorpha means strange acoelomates. A coelom being a body cavity, something not possessed by any of the animals that we've discussed so far. Acoelomate means without a coelom, so the xenocoelomorphs are no exception to that rule. Though not having a coelom is pretty weird for a bilaterian, but not unique to the xenocoelomorpha. Assuming that the anusless strange acoelomates truly are the hagfish of bilaterians, the remaining animals all fall into a single clade called the nephrozoa. And the nephrozoa are, in a word, bagels. At least usually. Earlier I asked you a question about bagels. If you stick your finger through the hole in a bagel, is your finger inside of the bagel or outside of the bagel? If I cut you open and stuffed a bagel into your body cavity, because you, unlike everything we've discussed so far, have a body cavity, and then sewed you up very carefully, what would happen to you? Well, if you know anything about junior mints, then you would probably know that it'd probably kill you. And that junior mints are very refreshing.
I don't want. No, they're good. I don't want any. Just take one. No, stop, Kramer, stop it.
So you really can't have a bagel get inside of your body. And that gets us to a very important question. How are you like a bagel? I think you can figure it out. And don't worry, even that isn't your disturbing similarity to bagels. It's just your similarity to bagels. But when you eat a bagel, is it inside or outside of your body? So the nephrozoa are bagels. And the bagels are divided into two major clades, the protostomia and the Deuterostomia. I'll get to the fundamental difference between these two clades later. But right now, I want to dive into the protostomia because it contains two of the raddest clades in existence, the Spiralia and the Ecdysozoa. I've already made multiple videos about members of these groups, but I can promise that each will receive a dedicated video in the near future. I'd like to take a moment just to say thank you to our patrons on Patreon who are Stinkin' Rad fans, get an extra video every week, and this one has a marvelous conversation about nematodes, so you probably don't want to miss it. The Ecdysozoa is probably the most successful animal clade on the planet. In fact, the biggest question is probably just whether nematodes or arthropods are the most successful. Nathan Cobb, the father of nematology, put it this way: if all of the matter in the universe, except the nematodes, were swept away, our world would still be dimly recognizable. And if, as disembodied spirits, we could then investigate it, we should find its mountains, hills, vales, rivers, lakes, and oceans represented by a film of nematodes. The location of towns would be decipherable, since for every massing of human beings, there would be a corresponding massing of certain nematodes. Trees would still stand in ghostly rows, representing our streets and highways. The location of the various plants and animals would still be decipherable, and, had we sufficient knowledge, in many cases, even their species could be determined by an examination of their erstwhile nematode parasites. While the number of described species is just in the tens of thousands, the number of actual species may be in the tens of millions, perhaps more. The Panarthropoda, the other major group of ecdysozoans, includes amazing creatures like velvet worms, tardigrades, toxicognath sporting centipedes, and their toxicognath lacking cousins, the millipedes. chelicerates, including spiders and other arachnids, not to mention insects and other crustaceans. In other words, it has the most described species of any group on the planet. The Ecdysozoa can most easily be distinguished by the fact that they're, bilateral bagels that grow by molting their cuticle, a process called ecdysis, hence the name. And as excited as I am to dig more deeply into this group, I might be equally excited about the other protostome clade, the Spiralia. It includes amazing groups like the secondarily acelomate platyhelminthes, also called flatworms, which often lack an anus. The mollusks, including the cephalopods that we covered earlier this year, annelid worms, brachiopods, and a bunch of other groups of animals that you never knew existed. Their most unifying feature being that they show spiral cleavage during early cell divisions as they develop. So anyway, lots of protostome videos are coming or already exist. But right now, it's time to bring this a bit closer to home. Because if you're a vertebrate, and I suspect that many of you are, then you fall into the final animal clade, the Deuterostomia. And now is probably as good a time as any to tell you the bad news about you and bagels. We just mentioned early embryonic cell divisions. Well, following cleavage, where the original cell called the zygote begins to divide rapidly, you are left with a ball of cells called the blastula, or the blastocyst if you're talking about mammals, but it's the same thing. So, much like a bagel, at one point, you were just a ball. Now, if you had a ball and you wanted to make a bagel, you would simply stick in your thumb and make a little pocket in imagination called a blastopore. If you push partway through, you'll get something that looks a great deal like a cnidarian, a comb jelly, or a xenocoelomorph. But if you keep on pushing, you'll get something resembling a bagel. And you will have a hole where food can pass through your body without actually going into your body. And where you don't need to multi-purpose your blastopore. So that's good news. You have a mouth and an anus. Hooray! But, and I mean that in the 1T way, this can go one of two different ways. One way, you could start with a mouth, in which case your anus would be the far side of your mouth. Or you could start with the anus, making your mouth the far side of your anus. As a fellow Deuterostome, I wish that I could tell you that we are mouth-first developers. But then I'd be lying right out of the far side of my anus. That is true for many protostomes, but not for us. And I won't even mention how lips and anuses are almost identical structures, and it's difficult to do anything with one of them without the other following suit to some degree. I'll just keep my lips and, well, you know, tight about that one. But, still with 1T, we need to find out who the Deuterostomes are. Other than just the butt-first brigade. 2 T's intended. Well, you're one! Assuming, again, that you're a vertebrate. But that's not the only thing that you could be. You could be any of the craniata, a group to which the hagfishes are the hagfish. And while we're talking about the hagfish of craniates, I need to make an amendment to our early video about the group. That video exists primarily to help you understand how to properly interpret phylogenetic trees. It works great. But our understanding of the relationship of jawed craniates to jawless craniates has changed in a very important way. It now appears that hagfishes and lampreys form a monophyletic group. So hagfishes alone are not the hagfish of craniates. They're just the hagfish of jawless fishes. Hagfishes and lampreys together are the hagfish of craniates. Chordates with a skull composed of bone or cartilage. Though there are other chordates, such as lancelets, which perfectly show off the basic chordate body plan, and tunicates, which, as adults, abandon the chordate body plan in favor of living their lives like a sea sponge. But chordates, at some point during their development, possess a notochord, which is a stiffening cartilaginous rod, not a spinal cord, a dorsal hollow nerve cord, which is your spinal cord, an endostyle, which is a filter-feeding organ that has become the thyroid, pharyngeal slits, and a muscular postanal tail. This is why snakes have tiny tails and long bodies, for the record. Tails are, by definition, post-anal. There are just over 80,000 known species of chordates, with about half being ray-finned fishes, and most of the rest being tetrapods, like me and whales. And because tetrapods are more closely related to ray-finned fishes than ray-finned fishes are to things like sharks, well, that explains why I've said on a few occasions that if trout and sharks are both fishes, then so are whales. And you. Assuming that you're some sort of tetrapod. And who are the closest relatives of the chordates? So glad you asked. Because they are exactly what you'd think. The members of the clade Ambulacraria. You know, the acorn worms and their allies of the phylum Hemichordata, and the Echinoderms, which definitely need their own video. I don't know what to tell you about hemichordates. They're super weird, worm-like deuterostomes. They have an anus that is at the end of the body. That alone will help you differentiate them from the chordates. And just for the record, worms aren't a thing. Phylogenetically, either all of the Bilataria are worms or worms don't exist. Worm just means a bilaterian that is long, and I don't want to look at it for long enough to tell you anything else about it. But the Echinoderms probably are the weirdest clade of bilaterians. If for no other reason than that they, as adults, aren't bilaterally symmetrical. They have a 5-way symmetry, pentaradial symmetry. And this group includes sea stars, also called starfish, despite not being fish, though not that far from fish actually, much closer than jellyfishes, which aren't even bilaterians, and considerably closer than cuttlefishes, crayfishes, or silverfishes, which are all protostomes. So of all the false fishes, these may be the closest to actually being fishes, though they may not look it. Other echinoderms include the similar-looking brittle stars, the spiky pincushion sea urchins and their flat doppelgangers sand dollars, the sideways sea cucumbers, which aren't closely related to cucumbers at all, but are just as close to being cucumbers as their cousins, the sea lilies, are to being lilies. It's a rad group, and we need a video about them just so we can talk about their tube feet, hydrovascular system, and bizarre feeding strategies. They're super rad. So of all these groups, which one should we dive into first? And which animal groups were new to you? As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon. As a fellow Deuterostome, I wish that I could tell you that we are mouth-first developers. But then I'd be lying right out of the far side of my anus.
Oh, good.
Oh dear. Yep, they're coprocophers too. You know, oral defecators, poop spitters. Got it.
Wow.
Got a disapproving head shake. That's all.
Poop spitting. Gross. What's some other things we could say?
Yeah, crap coffers. No. Let's see. Turd lip ticklers.
Turd lip ticklers. Oh, gross. That is gross.
Now, I was recently having this discussion in the comments to one of our videos.
Really?
And somebody made a case that I found very compelling.
Okay.
Which is that the hot dog is not a sandwich.
Okay.
It's an American taco.
Yeah. I like that. An American taco.